This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In a new investigation, the Huffington Post's Rebecca Klein found disturbing examples of private Christian schools that received taxpayer dollars through scholarship and voucher programs that were steering LGBTQ students into what's known as conversion therapy. It wasn't intended to change their sexual orientation. At the same time, Congress has allocated billions of dollars to help mitigate the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on K-12 school districts. U.S. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos is pushing to steer more of those dollars to private and parochial schools. Rebecca Klein joins us now. Rebecca, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thank you so much for having me.
We are going to talk about this new investigation looking at the conversion therapy that's being practiced by some of these parochial schools. But first, I want to talk about where things stand nationally in terms of schools that need help getting through the economic recession that's coming with this pandemic. So what is in this coronavirus stimulus package, which is called the CARES Act? There are multiple streams of funding, is that right?
Correct.
And does every school get a share of that money?
So for K through 12, the two major streams of funding, there's over $13 billion that are going to be given to schools via their Title I formula. So schools that serve higher proportions of low-income students will receive more of that money. And then there's another $3 billion, which is an education relief fund, which is specifically for significantly impacted school districts by the coronavirus. So there will be districts and schools that are receiving a lot more money than others, depending on the level of Title I students they serve, as well as the degree to which their schools have been impacted by the pandemic.
And how can schools use those dollars? What is allowable?
So schools are theoretically supposed to use this money to help with academic services that have been interrupted by this pandemic. So wraparound services, remote learning, things of that nature.
And is there money here that is going to go to parochial and private schools?
There's a few different ways in which this money could currently go to parochial and private schools. And bear with me because it's a little bit complicated. The first way is that Betsy DeVos has set up a competitive grant program. And as part of this grant program, states can apply to receive micro grants for families. And families can then use these micro grants to pay for educational services at private schools if they so choose. The other way in which this money will go to private schools is through something called equitable services, which is basically a rule that public schools are required to share some of their funding with private schools in their area that serve low-income students. However, Betsy DeVos is saying that the CARES Act funding should not be based on the level of low-income students these private schools are serving. As federal education law has previously stated, it should go to all private school students in the area. So that is a big chunk of funding that private and parochial schools may soon be getting through the CARES Act.
We should point out here that it's not a surprise that Betsy DeVos is trying to help and even protect private and parochial schools. Throughout her tenure and indeed throughout her career as an education activist, she has long advocated for this free market approach and also seeing private and parochial schools as an important piece of like the educational stream and structure, right?
That is correct. She has dedicated her career in education to promoting school choice, specifically private school choice, and trying to bolster public dollars for private schools.
What's been the reaction of the public school systems to this idea?
The public school systems are naturally incredibly upset. There are a number of states that have already said that they are going to ignore her call for them to share their money with all private school students. In response, she has said that this is illegal, that she's going to issue a rule saying that they must. But it is currently a huge source of contention.
And it's not necessarily that she's passing down a mandate or a law. This could be taken as strong advice, right? They could ignore it.
Right now, it seems like they could ignore it, but it seems like this is going to drag on some time and may have some eventual legal repercussions for them.
Secretary DeVos has tried mostly unsuccessfully to steer federal money to private schools via tax credit scholarships and voucher programs. And she's also wanted that as a school choice advocate in her home state of Michigan. Is there concerns that the stimulus money is a way for her to push that door open further?
Absolutely. As we know that she has had very little success since becoming Secretary of Education, passing the things she wants to pass that would funnel public dollars for private schools. And she clearly saw an opening in this regard. And she has said so. She was on a radio show a few weeks ago when someone asked her if she was taking this opportunity to try and bolster private schools. And she said, yes, I am. I think they need help and I would like to do that.
Well, let's talk about that. What is the argument being made by private and parochial schools as to why they need help right now? Where do they say they deserve it?
Obviously, public schools are suffering right now tremendously, but private schools are too. The economy has tanked. There are a lot of families who say that they can no longer afford to pay tuition. So private schools are seeing their enrollment numbers drop. If you look at Catholic schools specifically, they are bolstered by a number of avenues, one being a collection at church services. Right now, obviously, church services aren't happening or are not as popular. Not as many people are attending. There are schools that typically have spring fundraisers right now, and that has suffered as well. So private schools say that we are closing and we are suffering financially as well, and we deserve relief because we too serve a number of vulnerable students.
And I think it's also important that we not necessarily lump together these two different kinds of schools. Why is it important for education reporters to make some distinctions here between private and parochial?
So private and parochial schools are obviously very different in terms of how they're set up, how their funding is set up, and the types of families that attend. Parochial schools, specifically Catholic schools, they have a long history of trying to serve low income students specifically. They see themselves as very important to helping propel families to the middle class, and they have had a degree of success in doing so. So obviously, just as public schools are not a monolith, private schools are not, and they have different benefits and drawbacks, and they serve different types of students often.
I want to point out for our listeners, if you're looking for some information about the impact of COVID-19 on some of these schools, one good source is the Cato Institute. They are a think tank in Washington, D.C., and they've been tracking closures. And as of this week, they say that 60 private schools have permanently closed as a result of COVID-19. About 50 of them are parochial schools, and about 6 of them are independent schools. But isn't there an expectation among the public that if private and parochial schools are getting federal voucher money or even voucher money from states, that they're using it to help high-need students?
I think that's true in many cases, that there are children who felt like they weren't being served at their traditional public school, and so they went to the private school where maybe they got a scholarship or what have you, and they're being better served. And obviously, every student is different. But I think on the flip side, private schools do tend to serve wealthier families, and they also serve a small slice of the American population as well. 90% of students go to public schools. So I think every school is different. There are some incredibly affluent private schools, and there are some that really serve a diverse population of students.
We're talking with Rebecca Klein of the Huffington Post about her work looking into public dollars for private schools. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And the good news, we have the 73rd EWA National Seminar coming up July 21st to 24th. It will be virtual this year. We'd love to see you. Get more details and register online at ewa.org. Rebecca, we've talked about the Pandemic Relief Fund and how that might affect some private and parochial schools. I want to shift gears here and talk about your new investigation. It actually started in 2017 when you were looking at vouchers in private schools more broadly. What did you find?
At the time, I created a database of every private school in the country that was receiving public dollars, either through a tax credit program or a voucher program. Basically, because one of the things I wanted to learn was how many of these schools are religious. I wasn't finding any firm numbers about how often public dollars were going to religious schools. And a vast majority of these schools I found are religious, whether they're primarily Christian. And within, obviously, Christian schools, there's a ton of diversity. But, most of the public dollars going to private schools through these programs are religious.
And how did this new investigation, looking at this conversion therapy question, build on what you learned in 2017?
So, one of the things that I looked at in 2017 was of these religious schools, how many have explicit policies discriminating against LGBTQ students. And I believe at the time I found that at least 14% of religious schools had explicit policies in their handbooks saying that they took issue with LGBTQ students and families. One of the things I noticed when I was looking at these policies were there are a few handbooks that explicitly said, if we find out that you are engaging in an LGBTQ relationship, we will encourage you to attend counseling to deal with this. And if after this counseling you still express same-sex attraction, then you'll be kicked out of our school. So that was something that really stuck out to me that I saw in handbooks, but I didn't really have the opportunity to explore it more in depth until now with this investigation.
And what gave you the time to do it now? Was there a tipping point for you, or what set you off on this course?
It was pretty tedious in the fact that I was going through hundreds of handbooks to see how many had these policies. But the other thing was I really wanted to find students who had experienced this at these schools. And I had a hard time finding kids who wanted to go on the record about their experiences. I talked to a number of students who obviously were not included in the article because of this, who were just too traumatized by what happened to them and what their high school experience was like. So it just took a lot of coming together and finding the right people who could speak to this before I could write anything.
So the premise of conversion therapy is that someone could theoretically change their sexual orientation. And it can take a lot of different forms. I mean, it could be just a counseling session, or it could be actually a student being taken against their will to a residential facility or camp where they receive intensive indoctrination. Why do so many researchers and advocates say that this is not just doesn't work, but that it's actually potentially very harmful?
Yeah, there's a number of ways in which it's harmful. It is obviously incredibly psychologically harmful, basically, to have this practice dedicated to telling children that you are wrong and your feelings are wrong, and we can change that. And obviously, this is not something that can be changed. So I think it's incredibly traumatizing in that effect. There are some cases in which this therapy can be physically dangerous. There's something called aversion therapy, where people will try and give you electric shocks to try and get you to associate your same-sex attraction with negative physical feelings, or there's nausea-induced therapy as well. So overall, kids who go through this are much more likely to attempt suicide. They're much more likely to be depressed. Every medical group you could think of under the sun say this is absolutely, not only is it not real in that it doesn't actually help in changing someone's sexual orientation, but it can be explicitly dangerous.
It's interesting because I read this story, and when I was going through it, I was thinking about, some of the arguments that have been had over the years about when private and parochial schools get public money, does that mean the public has some sort of say or control over the curriculum and instruction? But we're not talking about a question of whether they're teaching intelligent design or refusing to teach climate change in science class. I mean, we're talking about something that's been documented that could actually harm kids.
That's something I thought about a lot because we know that there are a number of states now that have banned this practice. It is illegal to put a minor through conversion therapy. So it really sticks out to me that while some states are saying this is obviously dangerous and therefore we're making it illegal, there are other places where it's required by your school. It's just an incredibly jarring juxtaposition to me.
You did find a student who was willing to go on the record with you, and that's Megan Mishkin. She had been a student at Calvary Christian Academy in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. She's now a college student at NYU. How did you build trust with her? What was that process like?
So Megan and I have been talking for a number of years now. As I mentioned, I first got interested in this after my first investigation in 2017. I don't think I found Megan until probably a year and a half ago. But over the course of that time period, we always stayed in touch. So it's kind of funny, I knew her when she was early on in her college career, and she's switched majors and she's had different relationships since then. So, it's actually been interesting for me. I actually feel like I really know her as a person, and we spend a lot of time together.
Megan is a digital native, if you will, so, probably pretty savvy about how long things live on the internet, which is infinite at this point. What kind of conversations did you have with her about the reach this story would have and that her name would be attached to it?
I think she definitely had a good understanding of the implications of having something live on the internet. But something that I was very cognizant of, which I try and be when dealing with younger people, is I did not want her to be surprised by anything in the article. I did not want her to wake up and open this piece and be like, oh, I know I said this thing, but I didn't realize how it would sound. And now it's there forever. And I am just a college student. So I really took a lot of time to speak with her about, you know, what this article was going to look like within the bounds that I could, just so that she wouldn't feel like down the line she had this thing living there about something deeply personal to her that she was no longer comfortable with.
You also took a lot of time to build this digital paper trail to show the work, if you will, verifying her allegations. And I thought it was interesting because the school would say to you, well, we don't do this, but then they wouldn't say anything was actually wrong with what Megan claimed, which sounds like maybe things were a little bit different when she was there and maybe things have changed. How did you go about doing that? What were you thinking about how you were going to show your work here?
Something that I think was really helpful and important is that I did have this email that the school sent to her family at the time outlining the options that they were giving her. So no matter what, I felt safe that I did have one piece of irrefutable proof that this is what they said to her. In their response, which I thought was very interesting, in that, as you said, they say, this is not a practice or policy of ours, but they did not specifically refute anything that she said. The way I interpreted that to be is that we don't have an official policy, but we're not going to deny that this may happen. And the other thing that they said to me, which I thought was interesting, is they said, we don't have any therapists who do this on staff, nor do we partner with a specific organization who does this. But if you read Megan's story, she found her own therapist. She was basically told, go find your own. So she did. So nothing they are saying contradicts her story. They don't have therapists on staff who do this. They do not appear to partner with a specific organization who does this. And yet she still had to go find a therapist to undertake this.
And I'll be honest, the thing that jumped out at me when I read this email was when they outlined the choices that they gave Megan and her family. And the choices were they could have her pull out of the school because, quote, she didn't want to be responsible for her sexual preferences and influencing others. Or, and this is another quote, she could repent and ask to continue at the school. And then they would set her up with a counselor or mentor. And that word repent was so painful there.
This was obviously not a good place with her. She had a very difficult experience. And it's been interesting. I have already received another email from somebody who went to that school since publishing my article, who said, I did not have that specific experience, but this was not a healthy place for me to be. So, I think that this school specifically, and maybe schools like it, can be really painful if you're not aligning with their specific expectation of what a person should look like.
I do want to say, for better or for worse, covering private and parochial schools takes a back seat for many beat reporters. And that is understandable because, as you said, the vast majority of students do go to public schools. But why is right now, especially when we're looking at where this pandemic money going, why is now a time you think beat reporters should be paying closer attention to these schools?
Over the past few years, we've only seen more and more public dollars going to private schools. And this is something that I think is important because I think a lot of people live in these communities and they might have specific feelings about where their taxpayer dollars were going if they knew where it was going. Because what I found over the course of my research over the years is that there really is very little transparency about where this money goes and what types of schools they go to and how these schools treat children. And they're not subject to the same rules and regulations that public schools are. And even though, granted, yes, they only educate a small slice of the American public, it's growing. And there is a real audience for these things. And arguably the most important education leader in the country, Betsy DeVos, is a huge proponent. And therefore, I think it deserves a lot of scrutiny.
So if I'm a local reporter and I want to follow your lead, where do I start? How do I start gathering some of this data, especially since some of it may not be public information?
So I, in my pieces, have listed all the schools that I found that use this practice openly. And then for my previous investigations, I believe it should still work. We linked to a spreadsheet of all the schools that I found receiving public dollars, whether or not they're religious, whether or not they have a stance on LGBTQ students, and what types of curriculum sources they use. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of clearinghouse places to look at this data. I got all my data just from reaching out to states and local organizations, filing FOIA requests. But I think it's really important to know what the private schools in your community are doing, especially if they're receiving public funding.
And I think you make a good case in your piece for always try. You just sent requests and some schools actually answered you.
That's right. And also the fact that some schools are more public about these things than you might expect. So most of my information came from public schools' websites saying, this is what we do.
An A+ there for transparency. So, Rebecca, I do want to ask you, how are things going for you during this pandemic experience? Has it changed your reporting style?
Has it changed my reporting style? That's an interesting question. The obvious fact that it's much more difficult to go out into the field and weighing those considerations. It's changed my reporting style in the fact that everything feels so important right now. And I know everything always feels so important, but it really feels like the public is relying on getting this information. And, it is so important that we make sure we get it right, that we talk to people who need their voices represented. And it feels high stakes right now. It really does, which can be a lot of pressure, but is also really amazing because it just reminds you how important reporting is.
Rebecca Klein is a senior reporter for the Huffington Post. She covers education, policy, and politics. Rebecca, thank you again for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you'd like to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.